Shockwaves are tearing through churches, social media, and political circles alike. Because what Bishop Patrick Wooden just said has flipped the national conversation on its head. In the wake of Charlie Kirk's sudden and unexpected death, tributes flooded in from leaders across the country. But one voice didn't follow the script. Bishop Wooden didn't offer polished condolences or a safe public statement. Instead, he took to the pulpit and said what no one else dared to. His words? Bold, blistering, and deeply controversial. Was he honoring a fallen figure? Or using tragedy to ignite a cultural firestorm? Today, we're breaking down exactly what Bishop Wooden said, why it's dividing churches across America, and the deeper truth his message may have exposed. Because this wasn't just about Charlie Kirk's legacy, it was a mirror held up to the soul of the church itself. And what happens next might change everything. Let's get into it. Before we unpack the firestorm his sermon triggered, you need to understand who Bishop Patrick Wooden really is, and why his voice doesn't just echo inside the church walls, but shakes the national conversation every time he speaks. Bishop Wooden isn't your average Sunday preacher. He's the senior pastor of the Upper Room Church of God in Christ in Raleigh, North Carolina. And for over 3 decades, he's built a reputation as one of the boldest, most uncompromising leaders in the Pentecostal world. Where other pastors play it safe, Wooden leans into controversy. He's tackled abortion, LGBTQ agendas, political corruption, and moral decay from the pulpit, without flinching, without apologizing. It's earned him praise from conservative faith circles and harsh criticism from those who say he blurs the line between preaching and politics. But here's the thing, Bishop Wooden doesn't want to be popular. He wants to be heard. And his sermons often go viral not because they're polished, but because they're raw. He speaks in a tone that says, "I'm not here to entertain you, I'm here to convict you." That's exactly why, when the news of Charlie Kirk's death hit the nation, people waited. Not just to see if Bishop Wooden would speak, but how far he'd go when he finally did. And when he finally opened his mouth, he didn't just speak. He detonated a national conversation. But that wasn't the whole story. Charlie Kirk's death wasn't just shocking. It was seismic. In a matter of hours, news of the conservative firebrand's passing spread across the country like wildfire, first in whispers, then in headlines. He wasn't a former president, a movie star, or a pop icon. But his influence? Undeniable. Charlie Kirk was the founder of Turning Point USA, a movement that energized a generation of young conservatives, brought pastors into political rallies, and blurred the lines between pulpit and podium. He was bold, polarizing, and unapologetically combative. To his supporters, he was a warrior in the cultural battlefield. To his critics, a provocateur who stirred division wherever he went. And that's why his death hit differently. Across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, hashtags like #RIP Charlie Kirk and #TurningPoint exploded. Politicians issued statements. Church leaders offered tributes. Right-wing commentators mourned the loss of a young icon they believed was just getting started. But not everyone was grieving. The moment news of Kirk's death surfaced, old wounds reopened. Critics reappeared. His past rhetoric, his tactics, and his influence came under fire all over again. Some called him dangerous. Others called him misunderstood. But one thing was clear. Even in death, Charlie Kirk remained as divisive as ever. And that's exactly what made Bishop Wooden's response so explosive. Because while most leaders played it safe, Bishop Wooden saw the controversy and walked straight into it. What he said next stunned everyone. While most pastors stayed quiet or stuck to generic condolences, Bishop Patrick Wooden didn't. He waited. He listened. Then he stepped forward and lit a match that set the entire conversation on fire. There were no polite press releases. No carefully worded posts. Just a pulpit, a microphone, and a message that shook the room. Bishop Wooden looked out at his congregation and did what no one expected. He addressed the grief, the division, and the backlash surrounding Charlie Kirk's death, all at once. Yes, he acknowledged Kirk's impact. Yes, he respected the pain of his supporters. But then, with stunning boldness, he turned the spotlight, not on Kirk, but on the people reacting to his death. He didn't ignore the critics. He called them out. He condemned those who used Kirk's passing as a moment to mock, gloat, or settle scores. He called it unchristian. Dangerous. A reflection of something deeper than politics, something spiritually rotten. And he didn't stop there. Bishop Wooden pointed a trembling finger at the church itself. Not just the buildings. Not just the pastors. But the people. He asked, "What does your reaction say about your heart?" In that moment, it became clear. This wasn't a eulogy. It was an awakening. And what he said next would push that awakening straight into controversy. What started as a tribute quickly became something else entirely. In the middle of his sermon, Bishop Wooden pivoted. He looked past the headlines. Past the politics. And straight into the heart of the modern church. He didn't just honor Charlie Kirk's boldness, he used it as a mirror. A mirror that exposed something the church didn't want to see. He told his congregation, and the world, that while Kirk may have been controversial, his courage was undeniable. He said Kirk spoke loudly, even when it cost him. And then, with a voice that carried across the sanctuary, he asked a question that left people breathless. Why is the church so afraid to do the same? The room went silent. Bishop Wooden wasn't just challenging society anymore, he was calling the church to account. He warned that too many believers had become spectators. Silent. Safe. More worried about being accepted by culture than standing for truth. And then came the line that detonated across social media. We don't need to agree with everything a man says to honor his courage. But if the church loses its own boldness, we've already lost everything. In that moment, you could feel the tension crackle through the pews. Some people nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably. Phones came out. Clips were recorded. And within minutes, his words had left the building, and were making headlines. Because Bishop Wooden had done something rare. He turned a memorial into a movement. But that wasn't the only reason this message went viral. What he said next hinted at a much deeper issue, one that had nothing to do with Charlie Kirk, and everything to do with the spiritual identity of the church. Bishop Wooden's sermon didn't stay in Raleigh. It didn't stay in the sanctuary. Within hours, it was everywhere. Clips flooded Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. One clip, where he challenged the church's silence and praised Kirk's courage, racked up over 2 million views in a single day. The hashtags #BishopWooden and #CharlieKirk exploded across timelines. And then the reactions came, fast, loud, and divided. On one side, supporters hailed him as a hero. A modern-day prophet. Finally, someone speaking truth with no fear. Bishop Wooden said what every pastor is too scared to say. They praised his courage. They reposted his sermon with captions like, "This is what leadership looks like. Not political. Just real." But on the other side, the backlash was just as fierce. Critics called him reckless. insensitive, even dangerous. Some accused him of hijacking a tragedy to push a culture war. Others claimed he was using a man's death to lecture the grieving. And the timing? Too soon. Too raw. Too political. News outlets pounced. Conservative sites painted him as a fearless truth-teller. Progressive platforms labeled him inflammatory and opportunistic. Even within the church, the divide was undeniable. Some pastors reposted his sermon with amens and prayer hands. Others posted long threads condemning the message entirely. Because this wasn't just a sermon anymore. It had become a symbol of something much bigger, much deeper, and much more uncomfortable. And what was that exactly? As the sermon kept spreading, something became painfully clear. Bishop Wooden wasn't just talking about Charlie Kirk. He was talking about us. He used Kirk's death as a catalyst, but his real target was the church's compromise. The way we mourn. The way we divide. The way we choose who deserves grace, and who doesn't. Wooden's most piercing question wasn't about politics. It was about the condition of the heart. He asked, "What does your reaction to someone's death say about your soul?" For some, that question hit like a punch to the chest. Because it forced people to look inward. To admit that maybe, just maybe, their response wasn't rooted in faith or compassion, but in political tribalism. He called out Christians who cheered Kirk's passing, or remained silent while others mocked it. Not because of policy differences, but because their hearts had grown cold. Then, in a moment that felt more like a prophetic warning than a sermon, Bishop Wooden declared, "The church is sick. Not because of the world, but because we've let the world define how we love, how we speak, and how we grieve." That single sentence flipped the entire narrative. He wasn't defending Charlie Kirk. He was diagnosing a deeper infection. A church more loyal to political identity than to spiritual integrity. He said the silence of the church in moments of cultural pressure isn't neutrality, it's surrender. And he warned that if believers only speak when it's safe, they're no longer salt and light, they're just echoes in the noise. Supporters called it brave. Critics called it manipulative. But no one could deny, it hit home. Bishop Wooden didn't just spark debate. He exposed a growing civil war within the church itself. Across pulpits, podcasts, and prayer circles, believers are now asking the question, what should the church even be anymore? For one side, Wooden's message was a wake-up call. They believe the church has gone soft, too politically correct, too scared to offend. They say pastors need to stop watering down the gospel and start speaking bold truth, even when it hurts. To them, Bishop Wooden didn't go too far, he didn't go far enough. But for the other side? The sermon was a warning sign. They see it as another example of the church being hijacked by politics, of faith being twisted into a partisan weapon. These critics worry that sermons like Wooden's push people away rather than draw them in. That the pulpit is becoming a platform for division, not healing. This divide runs deeper than just opinions on Charlie Kirk. It touches everything: race, class, politics, theology. Should the church be a prophetic voice, boldly calling out cultural corruption? Or a refuge, offering comfort to the broken without picking sides? Bishop Wooden didn't just take a side, he planted a flag. And in doing so, he forced everyone else to decide where they stand. Because now the question isn't just what you believe. It's whether your faith is being shaped by the Bible, or by your political party. And that question? That's the one shaking the foundations of modern Christianity. But the most explosive part wasn't what he said about culture. It was what he said next, about the church itself. Just when people thought Bishop Wooden had said it all, he dropped the line that would haunt churches across the country. If we can't rise above politics to honor a life, we're not serving Christ, we're serving ourselves. And with that, the room shifted. Because Bishop Wooden wasn't just rebuking the world anymore. He was calling out the church, not for silence, but for selective compassion. Not for what it said about Charlie Kirk, but for what it refused to say. He asked why the church can't grieve someone without checking their political resume first. Why mercy now comes with terms and conditions. And why, in the name of truth, we've forgotten how to love. Then came the most chilling accusation of all. The church is sick, not because the world has changed, but because we have. We've traded holiness for popularity, conviction for clout. And now, even in death, we divide instead of weep. That moment? It broke something wide open. Some in the congregation were in tears. Others just stared in stunned silence. The camera phones didn't stop rolling. Because even critics couldn't deny, this wasn't just a pastor talking. It was a reckoning. Wooden ended by daring the church to repent, not for its politics, but for its pride. He said this wasn't about Charlie Kirk. It was about every believer who had allowed culture wars to replace Christ-like love. And that if this moment didn't wake the church up, then maybe nothing would. But here's the lingering question. Was this the beginning of real change? Or just another moment of outrage, destined to be forgotten? Bishop Patrick Wooden didn't just preach a sermon. He ripped the bandage off a wound the church didn't want to admit was infected. His words were raw. His tone was fearless. And the impact? Unmistakable. Some called him a prophet. Others called him reckless. But no one could ignore him. He used Charlie Kirk's passing not to score points, but to shine a brutal light on the spiritual condition of the modern church. He challenged believers to rise above party lines, above bitterness, above tribal loyalty, and return to something the church was always meant to be, a place of truth, grace, and courage. And that's what makes this moment so defining. Because this wasn't just about how we respond to death. It was about how we live, how we lead, how we love. So now the question isn't whether Bishop Wooden went too far. The question is whether we've gone far enough away from what really matters. And if this message fades like every other viral sermon. If it gets buried beneath the next news cycle. If it's silenced by fear, pride, or comfort. Then maybe he was right all along. Because a church that can't face its own reflection might already be lost.